The first time Alara heard the silence, she thought it was just the old house settling. It was a Thursday in late October, and she was practicing Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor in the music room of Blackwood Manor. The piece was all longing and melancholy, the left hand weaving a steady pulse beneath the right hand's aching melody. She'd played it 1,000 times, but here, in this cavernous Victorian house she'd inherited from a great-aunt she barely remembered, the notes felt different, dampened, as if the air itself were made of velvet. She struck a particularly resonant chord, letting it bloom and fade naturally, and in that fading, the precise moment when the last vibration should have dissolved into ordinary quiet, something else happened. The sound didn't just stop, it was taken. For a fraction of a second, the decaying resonance didn't gently evaporate, it was severed, snipped clean. And in the space where the echo should have been, there was not silence, but an absence, a hollow pocket of nothingness that felt less like quiet and more like a physical void. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but it left her fingers frozen above the keys, her breath caught in her throat. She played the chord again, same result. The note rang true, beautiful even, but its death was unnatural, violent. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small in the high-ceilinged room. The word traveled normally, fading as it should. Only music was affected. Alara was a restorer of antique instruments, a woman who understood sound as a physical substance, the way spruce vibrated, how horsehair drew resonance from gut strings, the precise tension of a piano wire. She knew sound had weight, texture, lifespan, and what she'd just witnessed was a violation of physics, a theft. She spent the next hour experimenting. She played scales, simple melodies, a dissonant cluster chord. Every musical phrase, no matter how brief, ended not with decay but with abrupt termination. The silence that followed each phrase wasn't empty, it was occupied. She could feel it pressing against her eardrums, a negative pressure, a suction where sound should be. By nightfall, she'd convinced herself it was fatigue, the drive from Boston, the stress of sorting through a dead relative's estate, the oppressive grandeur of Blackwood Manor with its shadowed corners and whispering floorboards. She made tea in the cavernous kitchen, the whistle of the kettle a normal, comforting sound. She drank it while staring out the bay window at the skeletal oaks clawing at a bruised twilight sky. The forest behind the house was ancient, a tangle of hemlock and pine that the locals called the Hushwood. Her great-aunt's lawyer had mentioned it with a tight smile. "Bit isolated out there. Quiet. You'll like the quiet, being a musician and all." But this wasn't quiet. Quiet was peaceful. This was hungry. The second day, she found the music room locked. She'd gone down for breakfast, the morning sun doing little to warm the drafty halls. When she turned the brass knob of the music room door, it wouldn't budge. She rattled it. Nothing. She checked the other doors on the main floor, the library, the parlor, the dining room, all opened freely. Only the music room resisted. Frowning, she fetched the heavy iron key ring she'd found in her aunt's desk. The third key fit. The lock turned with a gritty resistance, as if unused for years. But she'd been in that room yesterday, she was certain of it. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. Her sheet music lay open on the piano bench. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams cutting through the tall windows, but the air was different, colder, and the silence deeper. Not just an absence of noise, but a presence. She felt watched. She approached the grand piano, a magnificent 1890s Steinway, the reason she'd even considered keeping the place. Its ebony finish drank the light. She lifted the fallboard. The keys gleamed, ivory and ebony. She pressed middle C. The note didn't sound. Not a dud string, not a mechanical failure. The hammer struck the string, she saw it move, but no vibration reached the air. The sound was born and died instantly, consumed before it could escape the instrument's body. She tried another key. Same result. A third. Nothing. It was as if the piano were mute, its voice stolen. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked her spine. She backed away, her eyes scanning the room. That's when she noticed it. On the far wall, between two landscapes of stormy seas, hung a painting she didn't remember seeing yesterday. It was small, oval, in a tarnished silver frame. A portrait of a young woman in a severe black dress, her hair pulled back tightly. Her face was pale, almost luminous, but her eyes were closed, not peacefully, tightly shut, as if in concentration or pain, and her lips were parted slightly, not in a smile, but in the precise shape of someone about to sing a single pure note. Alara had studied every painting in the house upon arrival. There had been no portrait of a woman with closed eyes. She fled the room, locking the door behind her with trembling hands. That night the dreams came. She stood in a forest of towering pines, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in shattered coins. Before her stood the woman from the portrait, her eyes still closed, her mouth open in that silent note. She wasn't singing, she was listening, her head tilted, her entire being focused on a sound only she could hear. Then Elara realized she could hear it too, a faint, beautiful melody drifting from deep within the woods, a lullaby her mother used to sing. The notes were perfect, achingly familiar, but as the melody unfolded, something was wrong. The spaces between the notes, the rests, were wrong. They weren't pauses, they were gaps, voids where sound had been excised, and with each stolen rest, the forest grew darker, the trees leaning closer, their branches twisting into grasping fingers. The woman in black turned her head toward Alara, her closed eyes somehow seeing her, and a single tear traced a path down her porcelain cheek. Not a tear of sorrow, a tear of hunger. Alara woke gasping, her throat raw as if she'd been screaming, but the house was silent, too silent. She strained to hear the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounds she'd noted yesterday. Gone. Only a profound, listening quiet remained. She crept downstairs, drawn to the music room despite her fear. The door stood ajar. Inside, the piano bench was pulled out, and on the polished wood floor beside it lay a single sheet of music paper, blank except for 5 lines of a staff drawn in what looked like faint, rusty brown. Not ink, dried blood. On the staff, a single measure was notated, a simple ascending C major, but the rests between the notes, the quarter rests, the eighth rests, were not the usual symbols. They were drawn as tiny, perfect voids, little black holes on the page, and beneath the staff, in the same rust-brown script, were 2 words: "Play me." By the 3rd day, Alara was a prisoner in her own inheritance. She'd tried to leave, packed a bag, grabbed her keys, marched to the front door with grim determination. But when she turned the knob and pulled, nothing happened. The door didn't budge. She threw her shoulder against it, solid as a mountain. She ran to the kitchen door, the French doors, and the parlor. Every exit was sealed shut, not by locks, but by some invisible, immovable force. The windows wouldn't open more than an inch, as if gripped by frozen hands. Her phone had no signal. The landline emitted only a soft, breathy hiss. She was trapped, and the house was changing. The portrait of the closed-eyed woman now hung in the hallway outside her bedroom. She'd seen it there upon waking. Yesterday it had been in the music room. The day before, it hadn't existed at all. She began to notice other things. The grandfather clock in the hall no longer ticked. Its pendulum hung motionless at 12, but the hands crept forward nonetheless, marking the passage of time in utter silence. The fire she lit in the parlor hearth burned without crackle or hiss, the flames moving in a soundless, dreamlike dance. Even her own footsteps on the hardwood floors made no noise. She was living inside a vacuum, a world being systematically stripped of its sonic texture. Only one sound remained, her own breathing, and her heartbeat, loud, frantic, hers. A fragile island of vibration in an ocean of stolen silence. That afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, she returned to the music room. The blood-scored sheet music still lay on the floor. She picked it up. The paper was cold. She sat at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys. To play was to feed whatever lived in the silence, but not to play was to surrender to a terror that was already consuming her sanity. She pressed middle C. Nothing. The note died instantly. But this time, something else happened. As the sound was stolen, she felt it, a tug deep in her chest, a vibration pulled from her own body. A faint warmth left her fingertips. And from the corner of the room where shadows pooled thickest, she heard it, a soft, wet inhalation, like someone savoring a delicate aroma. She played the next note in the scale, D. Another tug in her chest, another stolen warmth, another soft inhalation from the shadows, closer now. E, F, G. Each note she played was devoured, and with each theft the presence in the room grew stronger, more defined. The air thickened, the shadows in the corner deepened, coalescing into a shape, a tall, slender figure with its head tilted back, mouth open. Not the woman from the portrait, something else, something that fed on resonance. She reached the final note of the scale, high C. Her finger trembled above the key. To play it would complete the offering. To refuse might mean what? She had no choice. The hunger in the room was palpable now, a pressure against her skin. She pressed the key.
The note vanished instantly, and the response was immediate. A wave of cold slammed into her, knocking her back against the piano bench. The room plunged into absolute blackness. Not the absence of light, but a darkness that felt solid. And in that darkness, she heard it. Not a sound, but the ghost of one. A whisper made of negative space. A voice composed entirely of stolen rests. More. It wasn't heard with her ears. It vibrated directly in her bones, in the hollows of her skull. It was the voice of the silence itself. She stumbled from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She didn't bother locking it. Locks were meaningless here. Upstairs in her bedroom, she huddled on the bed, arms wrapped around herself. She realized with dawning horror that the warmth stolen from her fingertips hadn't returned. Her hands were cold, and not just cold, numb, as if the very capacity to feel vibration had been leached away. She looked at her hands in the dim light filtering through the window. The fine lines on her palms seemed fainter, less defined, as if she were slowly being erased, note by note, sensation by sensation. The fourth day blurred into a fever dream of silence and dread. She stopped trying to escape, stopped trying to understand. She simply existed in the silent prison, jumping at the phantom echoes of a world that no longer made noise. She drank water that made no splash in the glass. She ate bread that made no crunch between her teeth. The act of chewing felt alien, disconnected from any auditory feedback. She was becoming a ghost in her own life. But the hunger in the house was not satisfied with ambient sound. It wanted music. It wanted her music. That evening, as twilight bled into night, she felt it, a pull, not physical, but resonant, a vibration deep in the floorboards, a frequency that matched the hollow space in her own chest. It drew her down the hall, past the portrait of the closed-eyed woman, whose lips now seemed curved in the faintest hint of a smile, to the music room door. The door swung open at her approach. Inside, the piano bench was pulled out, waiting. And on the music stand rested not one, but 3 sheets of blood-scored paper. A composition. A song. She recognized the melody instantly. It was the lullaby from her dream, the one her mother sang, but corrupted. The rests, the spaces between notes, were no longer mere gaps. They were drawn as jagged tears on the paper itself, as if the silence had clawed its way onto the page. At the bottom of the 3rd page, a new instruction. Sing. Terror seized her. To sing was to offer her own voice, her own breath, her own life force. But the pull was irresistible. It was in her bones now, a sympathetic vibration she could no more resist than a tuning fork could refuse to hum when struck by its match. She sat on the bench. Her cold, numb hands rested on her lap. She opened her mouth. The first note emerged, a thin, reedy sound, a child's lullaby note, C. It vanished before it fully formed, but the theft was different this time. It didn't just take the sound, it took the memory of the sound. As the note was stolen, the recollection of her mother's voice singing that exact note flickered and dimmed in her mind. A piece of her past was excised. She sang the next note, D. Another memory vanished, the feeling of her mother's hand on her forehead when she was sick with fever. E. The taste of her mother's apple pie on a rainy afternoon. F. The scent of her mother's perfume, lavender and vanilla. With each stolen note, a fragment of her identity was devoured. The song was not just consuming sound, it was consuming the emotional resonance attached to that sound. It was eating her history, her love, her very self. She tried to stop, clamped her mouth shut, but her jaw wouldn't obey. Her vocal cords vibrated against her will, compelled by the resonant pull of the silence. She was no longer singing, she was being played, an instrument for the hunger in the dark. Tears streamed down her face, but they made no sound as they fell. She reached the chorus of the lullaby, the part where her mother would always hug her tight. She sang the rising phrase. And as the notes were stolen, she felt it. The memory of her mother's embrace didn't just fade, it was unmade. The warmth, the safety, the love, it was extracted from her soul and fed into the waiting void.
A coldness rushed in to fill the space where that memory had lived. Not emptiness, a coldness with intent. She was halfway through the song when she saw it. In the corner of the room, the shadow figure had taken clearer form. Tall, gaunt, featureless, except for a mouth stretched wide in a silent scream of perpetual hunger. But beside it stood the woman from the portrait. Her eyes were still closed, but now a single continuous note flowed from her parted lips, a note of such pure, agonizing beauty that it made Alara's stolen memories ache with longing. The shadow thing wasn't feeding on the woman's song, it was feeding on the silence between her notes. And with each stolen rest, the woman's form grew fainter, more translucent. She wasn't the monster. She was the first victim, trapped for a century, forced to sing forever, so the silence could feast on the spaces in her song. Alara understood now. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost, it was haunted by an absence, an entity born from a silence so profound it had gained sentience and appetite. It couldn't create, it could only consume, and it craved the most vibrant sustenance of all, music, with all its emotional weight. She reached the final verse, the last line of the lullaby, the one that went, "Sleep, my darling, all is well." She opened her mouth to sing the final note, and in that moment of utter despair, a memory surfaced, not a stolen one, but a core truth she'd carried since childhood, a belief so fundamental it had never been attached to sound. Music is not the notes. Music is the intention behind them. The silence could steal vibration, it could steal memory, but could it steal purpose? As she shaped the final note on her lips, she didn't think of the sound, she didn't think of her mother. She focused on a single defiant intention. This note is not for you, it is a weapon. She sang. The note left her lips, a clear, strong G. And for the first time, it didn't vanish instantly. It hung in the air for a full second, vibrating with her will. The shadow thing recoiled, its form rippling like disturbed water. The woman in the portrait gasped, a silent, shocked intake of breath, and her eyes fluttered open for a fraction of a second. They were wide with hope. Then the silence struck. The note was devoured with violent force. But as it was taken, she didn't feel a memory stolen. She felt her intention transferred, a spark of defiance injected directly into the heart of the hunger. The shadow thing shuddered. It made no sound, but the entire house groaned, a deep structural protest. The windows rattled in their frames. For a single glorious moment, she heard it, the faint, distant chirp of a cricket from the hushwood, a real sound, unstolen. The victory was brief. The shadow thing recovered, its form swelling with renewed fury. It lunged not for her throat, but for her chest, towards the source of her resonance, her heart. She stumbled back, falling against the piano. Her hand struck the keyboard. A jarring cluster of dissonant notes erupted and died instantly. But in that microsecond of vibration, she saw her chance. She wasn't a singer, she was a restorer. She understood instruments, she understood resonance. She threw herself onto the piano bench, slammed the fallboard shut, and began to play not melodies, but frequencies. Low, rumbling clusters in the bass register, dissonant, jarring intervals designed not to please, but to vibrate, to shake. She played with her fists, her forearms, striking the keys with brutal, percussive force. She wasn't making music, she was creating raw, chaotic vibration. The silence fought back. Each note was devoured faster than the last, but she was playing faster than it could consume. She was flooding the room with dissonance, with noise stripped of meaning, a sonic assault of pure, unrefined physics. The shadow thing writhed, its form destabilizing. The woman in the portrait opened her eyes now fully, pale blue and filled with desperate hope. She joined her voice to Alara's assault, not with melody, but with a single continuous scream of pure frequency, a note of such unending agony that had been building for a century. The house shook. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. A crack snaked up the wall beside the portrait. Alara's hands were numb blocks of ice. Her chest burned with the effort of forcing breath through her constricted throat. She was fading, her own resonance being drained to fuel this final stand. But she played on, hammering the keys, feeding the silence a poison of chaotic vibration it could not digest. With a soundless implosion that sucked the air from the room, the shadow thing collapsed inward, not vanishing, but unraveling, its form dissolving into a million tiny silences that scattered like frightened insects into the cracks of the floorboards, the walls, the very fabric of the house. The hunger was not destroyed, it was dispersed, wounded, forced back into dormancy. The final note died. And then a sound, faint, trembling, but real. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Alara slumped over the keyboard, gasping. The woman in the portrait was gone. Only the empty oval frame remained on the wall. But as Alara watched, a single perfect tear of what looked like liquid silver traced a path down the dusty glass of the frame before evaporating. Dawn found her on the music room floor, wrapped in a blanket she dragged from upstairs. The house was no longer silent. She could hear the wind in the eaves, the distant caw of a crow, the steady, blessed tick-tock of the clock. Normal sounds, beautiful sounds. She never played the piano again, couldn't bear to, but she didn't leave Blackwood Manor. She stayed. She became its guardian. Because she understood now, the silence wasn't gone. It was sleeping, hibernating in the spaces between floorboards, in the hollows of the walls, in the negative space of every rest in every piece of music ever composed. It was a part of the house now, as fundamental as its foundation, and it would wake again. It always did. Some nights, when the moon is full and the wind dies down, she sits in the music room with the lights off. She doesn't play, she just listens. And sometimes, in the space between the ticking of the clock, a space that should be empty, she hears it, a faint, wet inhalation, a hunger waiting. And on those nights, Alara does something simple, something vital. She hums, just a single steady note. Not a song, not a melody, just a vibration, a reminder. I am here, I am resonant, and I am watching. She feeds the silence just enough to keep it drowsy, a crumb of sound to stave off the feast, a temporary truce in an endless war. For in Blackwood Manor, the most terrifying horror isn't the monster in the dark, it's the silence between notes, and the terrible truth that some hungers can never be satisfied, only postponed.